The silence in this house is a living thing. It breathes in the dusty air, settles on the velvet of the worn armchair, and curls up at the foot of my bed at night. It's been my most constant companion since Richard passed. Sometimes, its presence is comforting, a quiet friend that asks for nothing. Other times, like today, it feels heavy, a weight pressing down on my chest, reminding me of all the sounds that used to be here: Richard's booming laugh, the clatter of his keys in the bowl by the door, the low murmur of the television as he watched his old black and white films. The house is too big for me now, its hallways echo with memories I can only visit in my mind. Each creak of the floorboards is a ghost of a footstep. I trace the rim of my teacup, the porcelain cool against my fingertips. Outside, a pale, watery sunlight filters through the November clouds, doing little to warm the day or my spirits. I was looking forward to this evening. More than looking forward to it, I was clinging to it. Sarah, my daughter, had called last week to announce a special family dinner. "Just us, Mum," she'd said, her voice unusually bright. To celebrate, well, just to celebrate family. It was to be at the Gilded Vine, a restaurant I'd only ever read about in the glossy pages of magazines, a place with starched white tablecloths and wine lists as thick as novels. The expense of it had worried me, but Sarah had brushed it off. "Don't you worry about that. It's all taken care of for 7 days. That dinner has been a beacon. A small, glittering island in the vast, grey sea of my week. I'd planned my outfit, a deep blue dress that Richard always said brought out the colour of my eyes. I'd even practiced walking in my good shoes, the ones with the slight heel that make my ankles ache but also make me feel a little taller, a little more like the woman I used to be. The phone rings, its shrill cry slicing through the quiet. I pick it up, my heart giving a little flutter of anticipation. Perhaps it's Sarah, calling to confirm the time. "Hello?" I say, my voice a little too eager. "Mum?" It's me. It is Sarah, but the manufactured brightness from last week is gone, replaced by a rushed, tight tone that I know all too well. It's the voice she uses when she's about to deliver bad news she doesn't really feel bad about. "Hi darling," I say, trying to keep my own voice steady. "I was just thinking about tonight." There's a pause, a small crackle on the line. I can hear a television in the background, the tinny sound of a game show. "Yes, about that. Look, something's come up. Mark's had a terrible day, a huge deal fell through, and he's in a foul mood. And little Leo is coming down with something, a cough or a sniffle, I don't know. He's just miserable." I feel a familiar sinking sensation. It's a feeling I've grown accustomed to over the years, a slow deflation of hope. "Oh," is all I can manage. "Oh, the poor dear. And Mark, too. Is there anything I can do?" No, nothing. It's just, I really don't think we can make it tonight. It wouldn't be fair to the restaurant, and honestly, would be terrible company. I'm so sorry, Mum. I know you were looking forward to it." Her apology is a string of smooth, polished stones, offered without any real weight. I can almost picture her, standing in her pristine kitchen, one hand on her hip, eyes already on something else. I just feel awful about this. I stare at the faded floral wallpaper in my hallway, a pattern Richard and I chose together 30 years ago. It's peeling slightly near the ceiling. "Of course, darling. Family comes first. We can reschedule exactly. We'll do it again soon. Promised." Her voice is already distant. "Leo, turn that down." "Mum, I have to go. He's being a terror. I'll call you tomorrow. Love you." The line goes dead before I can say it back. The silence that rushes back in feels different now. It's not peaceful. It's mocking. I stand there, holding the receiver, the plastic suddenly cold and heavy. A deal fell through. Leo has a sniffle. It all sounds so plausible, yet it feels so thin, like a threadbare blanket that offers no warmth. I slowly place the phone back in its cradle. In the sudden quiet, I hear a tiny voice echo in my memory from the end of her call. "Leo, turn that down." He hadn't sounded miserable. He'd sounded loud, energetic, a healthy 7-year-old boy watching cartoons. And something else, something I couldn't quite place, niggles at the back of my mind. A tiny detail from last week's call. She said it was a surprise for me, but something about her tone then, and now, makes me wonder. Who was the surprise really for? I walk over to the window and look out at my small, overgrown garden. The roses Richard planted are bare now, thorny skeletons against the weathered fence. I feel a chill that has nothing to do with the November air. It's the cold bloom of suspicion, a seed of doubt planted in the fertile ground of my loneliness. I had allowed myself to hope, and now I feel foolish. It's not just the dinner. It's the ease of the cancellation. The casual way my beacon of a night was extinguished with a few hurried words. I feel like a pawn in a game I don't understand, a piece moved off the board because I was no longer convenient. And as I stand there, watching a single brown leaf detach from a branch and spiral to the ground, a quiet, stubborn thought forms in my mind. What if it wasn't a lie to protect a sick child or a stressed husband? What if the lie was to protect a secret? I spent the next hour in a state of suspended animation, caught between the sting of disappointment and the gnawing ache of suspicion. I made another cup of tea I didn't drink, tidied a stack of magazines that were already neat, and straightened the photograph of Richard on the mantelpiece. His smiling face, frozen in time from a holiday we took 20 years ago, seemed to look at me with concern. "Don't let them walk all over you, Ellie," he used to say, his voice a low rumble. "You have a spine of steel, even if you forget it's there." Sometimes I ran my finger over the cool glass. It was easy for him to say. He was the rock, the one who navigated the world with an unshakable confidence that I always admired but could never quite emulate. Without him, I often felt like a ship without a rudder, drifting on the tides of other people's wants and needs. The house felt cavernous. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to punctuate my solitude. I had mentally cleared my entire day, my entire week, for this evening. It was to be the main event. Now, the hours stretched before me, a barren landscape of empty time. I sank into the armchair, the worn velvet sighing under my weight. I began to replay the conversation with Sarah in my head, dissecting every word, every pause. The excuse was just a little too perfect, a neat package of domestic drama. Mark's stress, Leo's illness, two unimpeachable reasons that shut down any possibility of argument. It was clever. Too clever. My daughter is a capable woman, a successful real estate agent with a sharp mind for details and a sharper one for getting what she wants. She inherited her father's ambition but not, I fear, his deep-seated integrity. Over the years, I'd noticed a shift in her. The warmth of her youth had been lacquered over with a hard, polished veneer of materialism. Our conversations had become transactional. She'd called to check a box, called Mum today, her questions perfunctory, her attention clearly elsewhere. She and Mark lived in a world of sleek surfaces, minimalist furniture, and calculated social engagements. My world of faded chintz, comfortable clutter, and quiet routine was an inconvenient, slightly embarrassing appendage to their modern lives. They treated me with a kind of dutiful, impatient affection that felt more like a chore than a connection. I thought about the money. Richard had left me very comfortable. He was a prudent man, a brilliant architect who had invested wisely. He'd set up several accounts, some for my daily life, and one larger joint account with Sarah, intended for the upkeep of this old house and for any significant future expenses. "She'll help you manage it, Ellie," he had said, his trust in his daughter absolute. "She's good with numbers." At the time, it had seemed like a sensible precaution. Now, it felt like a vulnerability. "It's all taken care of," Sarah had said about the dinner. I wondered, with a sickening lurch in my stomach, exactly which account it was being taken care of from. I pushed the thought away. It was too ugly, too monstrous to contemplate. She was my daughter. She wouldn't, would she? The phone rang again, making me jump. I stared at it, my heart pounding. Was it Sarah, calling back to confess her lie, full of remorse? I picked it up tentatively. "Hello? Grandma." It was Leo's small, clear voice. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me dizzy. "Leo, sweetheart. How are you feeling? Your mum said you were under the weather." There was a brief silence. "I'm fine," he said, a note of confusion in his voice. "Mummy said I had to be quiet because she was on a work call. She said not to bother you." "A work call? Not a call to me, then?" My hand tightened on the receiver. "Oh, did she? Well, it's no bother at all, my love. I'm always happy to hear from you. Are you still coming to the party tonight?" he whispered, as if sharing a great secret. The word party hung in the air. Sarah had called it a dinner. The party at the Gilded Vine? With the shiny floors. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to keep my voice light, casual. "Oh, I don't think so, darling. Mummy said it was cancelled. Because you weren't feeling well, remember?" "But I feel great," he insisted, his voice rising in childish indignation. "And we are still going. Mummy just told Daddy to make sure his good suit was ready and that we can't be late because Mr. and Mrs. Albright don't like to be kept waiting." The Albrights. I knew that name. Mark had been trying to land a development deal with Albright Holdings for months. It was, in his words, the deal of a lifetime. My mind was racing, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with brutal, painful clarity. This wasn't a family dinner. It was never a family dinner. It was a business dinner. A high-stakes networking event to impress the Albrights, disguised as a family celebration to justify the expense from my account. I was cancelled like a reservation they no longer needed. "Leo," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "That sounds like a very important party. You be a good boy for your mum and dad, all right?" "I will, Grandma. I miss you too, my darling." More than you know. I hung up the phone, my hand trembling. The ugly thought I tried to push away was no longer a thought. It was a fact. They were not just lying to me, they were using me. They were feasting at my expense, both literally and figuratively, building their shiny future on the foundations of their father's legacy while discarding his wife like an inconvenient relic. The pain was sharp, a physical blow. But underneath the pain, something else was beginning to stir. A cold, quiet anger. Richard was right. I did have a spine of steel. And for the first time in a very long time, I could feel it beginning to stiffen. They thought I was just a lonely old woman, easily placated, easily dismissed. They had underestimated me. And that was a mistake they were going to regret. The initial shock was a wave that crashed over me, leaving me breathless and shivering. For a few long moments, I just sat there in the deepening twilight, the words of my 7-year-old grandson echoing in the oppressive silence of the room. A party. Mr. and Mrs. Albright. A deal of a lifetime. It wasn't just a lie, it was a calculated, multifaceted deception. They had built an entire narrative around me, casting me in the role of the cherished matriarch, all to provide cover for their social climbing and financial maneuvering. The pain of it was a bitter pill. It wasn't about the missed meal at a fancy restaurant. I could make myself a perfectly good shepherd's pie right here in my own kitchen. It was the casual cruelty of the exclusion. It was the realization that my presence was not only unwanted but was an active inconvenience to their ambitions. I was a loose thread on the expensive tapestry they were trying to weave, a thread they'd chosen to snip off and discard. I closed my eyes, and a montage of memories flickered behind my lids. Sarah as a little girl, holding my hand so tightly at the park, her face full of adoration. Sarah as a teenager, arguing with me about her curfew, her face full of fire. Sarah as a young woman, bringing Mark home for the first time, her face full of hope. Where had that girl gone? When did she become this stranger who could so easily lie to her own mother, using her own child as a pawn in her game? Greed, I thought. It's an acid that corrodes everything it touches: love, loyalty, decency. It had eaten away at the core of my daughter, leaving behind this hollow, ambitious shell. The grief for the daughter I had lost was as sharp as the grief I still felt for my husband. But as the minutes ticked by, the grief began to recede, replaced by something colder and harder. It was a feeling I hadn't felt in years, a dormant volcano stirring to life within me. It was resolve. I stood up and walked over to the mantelpiece, my movement stiff at first, then more certain. I picked up the silver-framed photograph of Richard again. I looked into his eyes, not for comfort this time, but for fortification. He was a kind and gentle man, but he was nobody's fool. He had a fierce sense of justice and an utter intolerance for deceit. He would never have stood for this. He would have been furious, not with loud, blustering anger, but with a quiet, formidable wrath that was far more terrifying. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't let this stand either. Not for me, but for him. For the legacy of integrity he had tried to build, the values he had tried to instill in our child. To sit here in silence, nursing my hurt feelings while they toasted their success with his money, would be the ultimate betrayal of his memory. My mind, which had felt so foggy and slow just an hour before, was now startlingly clear. The path forward was no longer murky. I wasn't going to call Sarah and cry down the phone. I wasn't going to have a screaming match or descend into bitter accusations. That's what she would expect. She would dismiss it as the emotional ramblings of a lonely old woman. She would weather the storm, offer a few more empty apologies, and then carry on exactly as before, perhaps with a little more caution. No. That was not the answer. The response had to be as calculated as their deception. It had to be precise, effective, and delivered on my terms, not theirs. They had chosen the battlefield, the gilded vine. They had set the time. And I decided, right then and there, that I would be attending their party after all. But I would not be coming as a victim. I would be coming as a reckoning. A quiet, dignified, and utterly devastating reckoning. I started to formulate a plan. It was audacious, and a part of me trembled at the thought of it, but the image of their smug, feasting faces fueled my determination. They saw me as a relic of the past, a footnote in their story. Tonight, I would remind them that the past has a way of shaping the present, and that footnotes can sometimes contain the most important information in the entire book. My first step was to find my old address book. It was a worn, leather-bound volume tucked away in the drawer of Richard's old desk. Its pages were filled with his neat, architectural script, a directory of friends and colleagues from a life well lived. I flipped through the brittle pages, past names that brought a pang of nostalgia, until I found the one I was looking for. Arthur Vance. Richard's oldest friend, his first business partner, and the executor of his will. A man whose integrity was as solid as the foundations of the buildings they once designed together. I hadn't spoken to Arthur in at least 2 years, not since the memorial service. Our lives had drifted apart, as they so often do. But I knew if there was one person in the world I could trust implicitly, it was him. My hand was steady as I picked up the phone and dialed his number. The plan was beginning to take shape, and with it, a sense of empowerment I hadn't felt since Richard died. They thought I was weak. They were about to learn how strong a woman can be when she has nothing left to lose but her dignity. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar, calm voice answered. Arthur Vance speaking. It was a voice that hadn't changed in 40 years, imbued with a quiet authority and an unmistakable kindness. Just hearing it was like finding a sturdy handhold on a slippery slope. "Arthur," I said, my own voice surprisingly firm. "It's Eleanor Vance." Richard's Eleanor. There was a momentary pause, and then the warmth in his voice bloomed. "Eleanor. My goodness, what a wonderful surprise. How are you?" It's been far too long. The genuine pleasure in his tone was a balm to my raw nerves. It was the starkest contrast to the hurried, artificial conversation I'd had with my own daughter. "I'm well, Arthur, thank you. And you?" We exchanged the requisite pleasantries, a brief dance of civility before I got to the heart of the matter. I didn't want to alarm him, but I also didn't have time for a lengthy preamble. The clock was ticking. "Arthur, I'm sorry to call you out of the blue like this, but I find myself in a rather delicate situation, and you are the only person I could think of who could possibly help me." His tone shifted immediately, losing its casual friendliness and taking on a professional focus. "Of course, Eleanor. Anything. What's wrong?" Are you all right? I'm all right, I reassured him. This isn't a medical emergency. It's a financial one. A matter of trust. It concerns the joint account Richard set up for me and Sarah. I could feel him listening intently on the other end of the line. I took a deep breath and laid out the situation as concisely and unemotionally as I could. I told him about the family dinners at the absurdly expensive restaurant, the last-minute cancellation, and the innocent but devastating revelation from my grandson, Leo. I explained my suspicion that the entire event was being funded from the account Richard had established for my care and the preservation of his home. I didn't embellish. I didn't cry. I presented the facts as a lawyer would present a case, letting the cold, hard details speak for themselves. When I finished, the silence on the other end of the line was heavy. I could picture him in his study, surrounded by law books and memories, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with a cold anger that mirrored my own. The sheer, unmitigated gall, he said, the words low and sharp. To use Richard's legacy, the money he set aside to ensure you would be safe and comfortable, to wine and dine business partners. It's beyond contemptible. His immediate validation was like a cool cloth on a fevered brow. I hadn't been imagining it. I wasn't being overly sensitive or paranoid. The situation was exactly as outrageous as I believed it to be. I need to know for certain, Arthur, I said. And I need to know what I can do to protect myself. Tonight, he repeated, understanding the urgency in my voice. Leave it with me, Eleanor. As executor of Richard's estate and co-signatory on the trust's formation, I have the authority to review the account activity. I also have the bank president's private number. It's Thursday evening, but for a matter of this gravity, he will answer. Where can I call you back? I'll be right here, I said, my gaze falling on the grandfather clock. It was almost 6 o'clock. The party, as Leo called it, was likely scheduled for 7:30 or 8. Time was closing in. I'll be as quick as I can, Eleanor. And please, try not to worry. We will sort this out. Richard would never forgive me if I allowed this to happen. I hung up the phone feeling as though a great weight had been shared. I was no longer alone in this fight. I had an ally, an old and powerful one. Arthur was a man of action, a man who, like Richard, understood that justice requires not just sentiment but strategy. While I waited, I moved with a newfound purpose. I went upstairs to my bedroom, the floral carpet soft under my feet. I opened my wardrobe, the scent of lavender and cedar filling the air. I pushed past the sensible cardigans and practical skirts I wore for my daily life, my fingers searching for the dress bag at the very back. I unzipped it carefully. Inside was the blue dress. A deep, midnight blue silk that shimmered under the light. It was a dress Richard had bought me for our 35th wedding anniversary. I had worn it exactly once, to a gala at the museum his firm had designed. Seeing it now, I felt a pang of nostalgia, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of reclaiming myself. I was not just a widow in a lonely house. I was Eleanor Vance. I had danced with my husband in grand ballrooms, I had hosted dinners for dignitaries, I had raised a daughter and built a life. This dress was a reminder of that woman. I laid it on the bed and began to get ready, my movements deliberate and focused. I was not dressing for a party. I was preparing for battle. I was putting on my armor, piece by piece. The woman who would walk into the gilded vine tonight would not be the frail, forgotten mother they had left behind. She would be a stranger to them, a woman of strength and resolve they had never bothered to get to know. The phone rang again precisely 45 minutes later. I took a deep, steadying breath before I answered. Eleanor, Arthur's voice was grim. It's exactly as you suspected. In fact, it's worse. The cold knot of dread in my stomach tightened as Arthur spoke. His voice, usually so measured, was now clipped and sharp, each word a small, hard pellet of truth. It's worse, he had said, and the silence that followed was filled with my own worst fears. I sank onto the edge of my bed, the silk of the blue dress cool against my skin, and listened as he detailed the extent of the betrayal. It wasn't just a few $100s for a lavish dinner. Over the past 6 months, Sarah and her husband, Mark, had been systematically siphoning funds from the joint account. There were withdrawals for a luxury car lease in Mark's name, charges from designer boutiques on streets I had only ever window shopped, and a payment for a week-long stay at a 5-star resort in the Caribbean. Each transaction was a small, sharp stab of betrayal. The money itself, while substantial, was secondary. It was the calculated, cold-blooded nature of the deception that took my breath away. They had been living a life of secret luxury, funded by the money my husband had worked his entire life to secure for my future. The account, intended for roof repairs, property taxes, and the simple dignity of not having to worry in my old age, had become their personal slush fund. The dinner tonight, Eleanor, Arthur continued, his voice tight with controlled fury, is the pinnacle of their audacity. They've booked the restaurant's most exclusive private room, that vintners sell us. They've pre-ordered vintage champagne and a 7-course tasting menu. The estimated bill, which they have pre-authorized against your account, is just shy of $10,000. $10,000. The number hung in the air, obscene and unbelievable. It was more than I spent on my own living expenses in 6 months. All for one night of posturing, of trying to impress a man named Albright. The scope of their greed was breathtaking. It was a pathology. They've drained nearly a third of the principal, Eleanor, Arthur said softly, his anger giving way to a tone of deep concern. Richard set that up to last you for the rest of your life. At this rate, it would be gone in less than 3 years. A wave of dizziness washed over me. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. This wasn't just about disrespect anymore. This was about my survival. They were not just neglecting me, they were actively endangering my future, gambling it away for their own immediate gratification without a second thought for the consequences. I took a shaky breath, steadying myself. This was not the time to crumble. This was the time to act. What can we do, Arthur? I asked, my voice a low whisper. Can we stop the payment for tonight? We can do more than that, he said, and I could hear the strategist in him taking over. I have already spoken to the bank's fraud department. Given my status as executor and the clear evidence of misappropriation, I have the authority to act on your behalf. With your verbal consent, right now, I can have the joint account frozen completely. They won't be able to withdraw another penny. Furthermore, I can initiate a transfer of the remaining balance into a new account, in your name only. The bank is prepared to act immediately. Yes, I said, the word coming out with a strength that surprised me. Yes, do it. Freeze everything. Move the money. Now, consider it done, he replied. It will take about 30 minutes to process everything. When they present the card for the final bill tonight, it will be declined. A small, bitter smile touched my lips. The image of Mark's face, smug and confident, turning to baffled fury as the waiter returned with the rejected card, was a satisfying one. But it wasn't enough. Just stopping the payment felt reactive. I needed to do something proactive. I needed to reclaim not just my money, but my narrative. Arthur, I said, my plan crystallizing into its final, brilliant form. There's more. I don't just want to stop them. I want to make a statement. A statement they will never forget. I explained my idea. I spoke for several minutes, laying out the details of what I wanted to do at the restaurant. It was bold, theatrical, and utterly unprecedented for me. As I spoke, I could feel the last vestiges of the timid, lonely widow falling away, replaced by a woman who was taking control of her own destiny. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. I wondered if I had gone too far, if he would think me vengeful or foolish. Eleanor, Arthur said finally, and there was a note of profound admiration in his voice. Richard always said you were the strongest person he knew. I'm beginning to think he was understating the case. It's a brilliant plan. It's not just punitive, it's poetic. And I would be honored to help you execute it. We spent the next 20 minutes finalizing the details. He made another call, this time to the head of the Richard Vance Architectural Foundation, the charity my husband had founded to provide scholarships for underprivileged students. I gave Arthur the authority to act as my proxy, to make a pledge on my behalf. Everything was falling into place. "I'll meet you there," Arthur said. 7:45, outside the restaurant. "We'll walk in together, thank you, Arthur," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "For everything, don't thank me, Eleanor. I'm just helping you remind your daughter what a real legacy looks like. It isn't about expensive dinners. It's about character." After we hung up, I stood and faced my reflection in the full-length mirror on the wardrobe door. The woman staring back at me was someone I almost didn't recognize. Her eyes were bright with a fierce, determined light. Her posture was straight, her shoulders back. The blue dress was no longer just a garment, it was a declaration. They had intended to feast on my generosity. They had planned to toast their success with my money. But they had made a critical miscalculation. They had mistaken my quietness for weakness, my solitude for helplessness. Tonight, I would serve them a final course they never ordered, a dish of consequences, served cold. And it would be a taste they would never, ever forget. The taxi ride through the city was like a journey through a different dimension. The familiar, quiet streets of my neighborhood, with their sleeping houses and soft porch lights, gave way to the vibrant, pulsing arteries of the downtown core. Neon lights bled across the wet asphalt, and the silhouettes of strangers hurried along the pavements, each a protagonist in their own drama. I sat in the back of the cab, my hands folded calmly in my lap, and watched the world slide by beyond the glass. I felt strangely detached, an observer in the moments before a storm breaks. There was no fear, no anxiety. The turmoil of the afternoon had settled into a profound and unshakable calm. I was no longer a victim of circumstances, I was the architect of them. I thought about Richard. Not with the usual pang of loss, but with a sense of partnership. It felt as if he were sitting beside me, his solid, comforting presence a silent endorsement of my actions. We had built our life on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values. We believed in hard work, in honesty, in quiet philanthropy, in leaving the world a little better than we found it. What Sarah and Mark were doing was a desecration of all of that. Their world was built on shifting sands of appearance and acquisition. My actions tonight were not about revenge. Revenge is a hot, messy emotion. This was about restoration. It was about restoring the integrity of my husband's name and reasserting the values he held dear. It was about rebalancing the scales that had been tipped so dangerously toward greed and disrespect. The taxi pulled up to a curb in front of an imposing, modern building with a discreetly lit sign that read "The Gilded Vine." The entrance was all glass and polished chrome, and through it, I could see a world of hushed elegance. A doorman in a heavy coat rushed to open my door, his expression one of polite, professional appraisal. I stepped out onto the pavement, the cool night air fresh on my face. I saw Arthur waiting for me under the awning, just as he said he would be. He was a handsome man, still distinguished in his late 70s, wearing a beautifully tailored charcoal suit. He looked solid, dependable, a rock in a turbulent sea. His face broke into a warm smile when he saw me. "Eleanor," he said, taking both my hands in his. "You look magnificent." "Truly, you're very kind, Arthur," I said, feeling a genuine warmth spread through my chest. "Are you ready?" "I am," he said, his eyes twinkling. "I have the confirmation from the foundation on my phone. The press release is drafted and ready to be sent to the city's business journal first thing in the morning. And I took the liberty of booking a table for two for us, here, for 9 o'clock. I have a feeling you'll have an appetite by then." His foresight and quiet competence were immensely comforting. He offered me his arm, and I took it. Together, we walked through the revolving glass doors and into the restaurant's lobby. The interior was even more opulent than I had imagined. The air was scented with expensive perfume and the rich aroma of gourmet food. The sound was a low, pleasant hum of cultured conversation and the clink of crystal glasses. A hostess, a young woman with a practiced smile and an iPad, glided toward us. "Good evening," she said. "Do you have a reservation?" "We do," Arthur said smoothly. "For Vance, at 9. But first, we're here to briefly join the party in the vintner's cellar." The Albright party. The hostess's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of confusion crossed her eyes. Unannounced guests for the most exclusive room were likely not part of her usual protocol. Of course, sir. Let me just announce you, that won't be necessary, I said, my voice calm and clear. We're family. We'd like to surprise them. I gave her a smile that I hoped was disarming, the smile of a benevolent grandmother. It seemed to work. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Of course, madam. It's right this way. She led us through the main dining room, a cavern of soft lighting, white linen, and quiet intimacy. Diners looked up as we passed, their conversations pausing for a moment. I felt their eyes on me, on my blue dress, on my distinguished escort. I felt not like an intruder, but like I belonged. We arrived at a heavy, dark wood door at the back of the restaurant. The hostess pushed it open gently, revealing a scene of brightly lit revelry. It was a private world, insulated from the rest of the restaurant. A long table was laden with food, wine glasses sparkled, and a dozen people were seated, their faces animated with laughter and conversation. At the head of the table, holding court, were Sarah and Mark. Mark was leaning forward, his face flushed with wine and self-importance, telling a story to a silver-haired man I presumed was Mr. Albright. Sarah was laughing, her head tilted back, a diamond necklace glittering at her throat. My grandson, Leo, was seated near the end of the table, looking small and overwhelmed, poking at a bread roll on his plate. For a single, heart-stopping moment, I faltered. This was my child. My flesh and blood. A part of me wanted to turn and walk away, to leave the ugliness undisturbed. But then I saw it. I saw the casual arrogance in Mark's posture, the brittle, socialite's laugh from Sarah. I saw the $10,000 lie they were living, and I saw the small, forgotten boy at the end of the table who was their only connection to anything real. I looked at Arthur. He gave my arm a reassuring squeeze. My resolve hardened once more. The hostess stepped aside, and we stepped across the threshold, into their private world. And just as we did, Leo looked up. His eyes widened, and a huge, pure smile spread across his face. "Grandma," he shouted, his little voice cutting through the adult chatter. Every head at the table snapped in our direction. The laughter, the conversation, the clinking of glasses, it all stopped. Instantly. The silence that fell was absolute, a sudden, deafening void. Sarah's smile froze on her face, then shattered. Mark's jaw went slack, the wine glass halfway to his lips. Their expressions of shock, of disbelief, of pure, unadulterated horror were my first taste of victory. And it was delicious. The silence in the vintner's cellar was so profound it was almost comical. It was as if I had flicked a switch and turned off the sound for the entire room. A dozen pairs of eyes were fixed on me and Arthur, their expressions ranging from the polite confusion of the guests to the sheer, panicked terror on the faces of my daughter and her husband. Sarah was the first to recover, though her recovery was clumsy. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping noisily on the stone floor, and stood up. The practiced grace she usually wore had vanished, replaced by a jerky, puppet-like stiffness. "Mum," she stammered, her voice a full octave higher than usual. What are you doing here?" "I thought you were." She couldn't finish the sentence. She couldn't say, "I thought I had successfully lied to you and gotten away with it." Mark, meanwhile, looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. The ruddy, confident glow had drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. He just stared, his mouth slightly agape, the picture of a man whose carefully constructed world had just been hit by a wrecking ball. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment longer, savoring it. I let them all look at me, standing there in my blue silk dress with Arthur, a picture of elegance and composure. I wanted them to see that I was not the woman they thought they knew. "Hello, darling," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying easily through the quiet room. "I hope we're not interrupting." I smiled warmly, a grandmotherly smile that was entirely at odds with the surgical precision of my attack. I directed my gaze to the silver-haired man next to Mark. "You must be Mr. Albright." "I'm Eleanor Vance." "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." I've heard so much about you, and Mr. Albright, a man clearly accustomed to being in charge, rose from his seat. He was confused, but his manners were intact. "A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Vance," he said, extending a hand, which I shook gracefully. "I'm afraid I wasn't expecting." "Oh, I'm sure you weren't," I said, my smile unwavering. "My daughter likes her little secrets." I turned my gaze to Sarah, whose face was now a frantic kaleidoscope of emotions, fear, anger, and utter humiliation. "Sarah, dear, you didn't tell me you were having a party. You told me dinner was cancelled because poor Leo was sick and Mark was having a terrible day. But Leo looks perfectly fine, and Mark, you seem to be having a wonderful time." My words were sweet as honey and sharp as glass. I saw a flicker of comprehension in Mr. Albright's eyes. He was a smart man. He was beginning to understand that he had been seated at a table where a family drama of epic proportions was about to unfold. Mark finally found his voice, a blustering, angry sound. "Eleanor, this is highly inappropriate. This is a private business meeting. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to leave." "Now, oh, I don't think so," I said, my voice losing its gentle edge and taking on a spine of steel. "You see, I've come to believe this dinner is very much my business. In fact, one might say I'm the primary sponsor of this little event." I let my eyes drift over the opulent spread on the table, the glistening platters of seafood, the half-empty bottles of champagne, the elaborate floral centerpiece. "This is all very lovely. Very expensive. I'm so glad to see the money my Richard worked so hard for is being put to such good use. Building business relationships. Impressing important people. It's exactly the kind of thing he would have wanted." The sarcasm was light, but it landed with devastating effect. The other guests at the table were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between me and their hosts. They had come for a pleasant dinner and were now unwitting spectators to a public execution. "Mum, please," Sarah whispered, her voice pleading. She took a step towards me, her hands outstretched. "Let's not do this here." "Do what, darling?" I asked innocently. "Tell the truth. I think here is the perfect place for it. After all, you chose the venue." I turned my attention back to the room at large. "You see," I began, my voice clear and steady, addressing everyone at the table. "My daughter and her husband led me to believe they were cancelling our family dinner tonight. Instead, they decided to host this lovely gathering and fund it with money from my account. An account my late husband set up for my care. They lied to me, and they have been stealing from me for months." Gasps rippled around the table. Mr. Albright took a half step back, his expression hardening into one of distaste. He was a man of old money and established reputation. He would have no tolerance for this kind of sordid, greedy drama. Sarah let out a small, strangled sob. "That's not true." "It is true," Arthur's voice boomed from beside me, solid and authoritative. "I am Arthur Vance, executor of the late Richard Vance's estate. I have seen the bank statements myself. The withdrawals for cars, vacations, and this very dinner are all documented." The arrival of a second, even more distinguished-looking accuser sealed their fate. The guests now looked at Sarah and Mark with open contempt. Their credibility, the very currency they were trying to build with this dinner, had been utterly incinerated in the space of 5 minutes. I walked slowly toward the table, my heels clicking purposefully on the floor. I stopped beside Leo, who was watching the proceedings with wide, confused eyes. I placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It's all right, my love," I whispered. "Grandma's here now." Then I looked directly at Sarah and Mark. Their faces were ashen. They were trapped, exposed, and utterly defeated. "You thought I wouldn't find out," I said, my voice low and filled with a profound, sorrowful power. "You thought I was old, and foolish, and irrelevant. You dismissed me. But you have one more surprise coming tonight. And I do believe this one is a surprise you will never forget." The air in the vintner's cellar was thick with shame. Sarah stood frozen, tears streaming silently down her face, her carefully constructed composure shattered into a million pieces. Mark looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Their guests, The very people they had been so desperate to impress were now looking at them with a mixture of pity and disgust. They had paid for a seat at a power dinner and had instead received a front-row ticket to a moral car crash. I had their complete and undivided attention. "You see," I continued, my voice calm and measured, a stark contrast to the emotional wreckage around me. "When I discovered this deception, this afternoon, I was faced with a choice. I could have called you, Sarah. We could have had another one of our difficult conversations. There would have been tears, and excuses, and empty promises to pay me back. And nothing would have fundamentally changed." I paused, letting the weight of that truth settle in the room. But I realized that this wasn't just about money. It was about principles. It was about legacy. My husband, Richard, spent his life building things of value, things of permanence. He built buildings that shaped the city's skyline, and he built a reputation based on integrity and honor. The money you have been squandering was not just currency, it was a physical manifestation of his life's work. And you treated it like loose change for your fleeting ambitions. I took a deep breath. It was time for the final act. So I decided to honor my husband's legacy in a way that he would have truly appreciated. I made a few phone calls this afternoon. I turned to Arthur. He understood his cue perfectly. He stepped forward, holding his phone. As Mrs. Vance's representative and executor of Richard's estate, Arthur announced in his clear, authoritative voice, "I was instructed to contact the Richard Vance Architectural Foundation. It's a charity Richard founded 20 years ago to provide scholarships to promising but underprivileged students of architecture, young people who have the talent, but not the means, to follow their dreams." A new kind of silence fell over the room. This was no longer just about a family squabble. I could see Mr. Albright lean forward slightly, his expression shifting from distaste to genuine interest. This was a language he understood: philanthropy, legacy, foundations. "This afternoon," I said, my voice ringing with a power I didn't know I possessed, "I made the decision to liquidate the specific assets from which you have been so freely helping yourselves. The entire remaining principal of that account. And I have redirected it. All of it." I let that sink in. Sarah's sobbing stopped. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, new kind of horror. This was a consequence she could never have imagined. "Just an hour ago," Arthur continued, his voice resonating with gravitas, "on behalf of Eleanor Vance, I pledged a donation of $1.2 million to the Foundation's endowment fund." A collective gasp went through the room. The sum was staggering. The sheer scale of it transformed the entire event. It was no longer a sordid family fight but a moment of breathtaking philanthropic power. "This donation," Arthur added, looking directly at Mr. Albright, "will be the largest single gift the Foundation has ever received. It will endow the Richard and Eleanor Vance scholarships in perpetuity, funding the education of dozens of future architects for generations to come." I looked at my daughter. The color had drained completely from her face. She looked at me, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. She wasn't just seeing a lost inheritance. She was seeing the monumental scale of her miscalculation. She was seeing a legacy she could have been a proud custodian of, now given away, publicly and irrevocably, because of her own boundless greed. "So, you see," I said, my voice softening slightly, but with no less impact. "Your party tonight is a celebration after all. Just not the one you planned. You have gathered all these influential people to bear witness to this moment. You've inadvertently hosted the inaugural fundraising dinner for the Vance Scholarship. So I suppose I should thank you." The situational irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Their meticulously planned evening of social climbing had been transformed into a public monument to their own disgrace and my empowerment. I then did something I hadn't planned, a final, perfect flourish. I turned to the restaurant manager, who had been hovering nervously by the door. "Excuse me," I said kindly. "Would you be so good as to bring the bill for this evening's festivities? I believe my daughter and son-in-law will want to settle it with their own money." This time the manager, eager to defuse the situation, nodded quickly and disappeared. This was the final, devastating blow. The public humiliation of having to pay for their charade after the revelation of their theft and the loss of their inheritance was absolute. I bent down and kissed the top of Leo's head. "Come along, sweetheart," I whispered. "You're coming home with Grandma tonight." Leo, who had been watching everything with a child's unfiltered clarity, nodded eagerly and slid off his chair, taking my hand without a moment's hesitation. His small, warm hand in mine was the only thing in the room that felt truly real. I stood up straight, holding my grandson's hand, and faced my daughter one last time. She just stared at me, her face a mask of utter devastation. There was nothing left to say. I had taken back my money. I had taken back my dignity. I had taken back my story. And now, I was taking my grandson. With Arthur by my side and Leo's hand in mine, I turned my back on the wreckage of their ambition and walked out of the vintner's cellar, leaving them alone in the ruins of the evening they had so carefully planned at my expense. The silence they had tried to condemn me to was now theirs to keep. Walking out of the gilded vine was like surfacing for air after being underwater for a very long time. The cool night air hit my face, sharp and clean, washing away the cloying atmosphere of the private dining room. The sounds of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of traffic, the chatter of people passing by on the street, were the sounds of life, real and unscripted. It was a world away from the suffocating, artificial silence I had left behind me. Leo's small hand was a warm, solid anchor in mine. He looked up at me, his face a mixture of confusion and relief. "Is Mummy sad, Grandma?" he asked, his voice small. I knelt down on the pavement, right there on the busy city street, so I could look him in the eyes. "Yes, sweetheart," I said gently. "Mummy and Daddy made some very bad choices, and now they are sad because of them. But that is not your fault. None of this is your fault. You are a wonderful boy, and I love you very much." He seemed to accept this, nodding solemnly. He trusted me, and in that moment, I felt a fierce, protective love for him that was clarifying. This was what mattered. Not the money, not the revenge, but this little boy and the future we could still have together. Arthur hailed a taxi, his presence a quiet, reassuring strength beside me. He helped Leo into the back seat and then held the door for me. As I settled into the seat, I glanced back at the restaurant's glass facade. I couldn't see into the vintner's cellar, but I could imagine the scene, the hurried, whispered apologies to the departing guests, the frantic phone calls to a bank that would not answer, the arrival of a bill that they could not pay. I felt no triumph, no gloating joy. Just a profound and weary sense of closure. The war was over. The journey back to my house was quiet. Leo, exhausted by the drama and the late hour, fell asleep with his head on my lap, his soft breaths fogging the cool window pane. I stroked his hair, my mind replaying the events of the evening. I had walked into that restaurant a victim, and I had walked out a victor. But the victory felt different than I had expected. It wasn't a fiery, exultant feeling. It was a quiet, solid sense of rightness, of having restored a natural balance that had been violated. Arthur sat in the front seat, respecting my silence. When we arrived at my front door, he helped me carry the sleeping Leo inside and laid him gently on the sofa, covering him with a soft afghan from the back of my armchair. "I'll call a car for myself," he said, standing in the hallway. "Eleanor, what you did tonight. It was remarkable. I couldn't have done it without you, Arthur," I said, my voice filled with gratitude. "You were my rock for nonsense," he said with a wave of his hand. "I was merely the legal scaffolding. You were the architect of the entire affair." Richard would have been immensely proud. He paused, his expression serious. "What happens now, with Sarah?" I looked at the peeling wallpaper by the door, at the faint water stain on the ceiling from a leak I'd been meaning to fix. This house, once my sanctuary, now felt like a mausoleum. It was filled with memories of a family that no longer existed in the way I remembered it. "I don't know," I said honestly. "The ball is in her court now. But I know what happens for me. I'm not going to live here anymore, waiting for the phone to ring. I'm not going to be the lonely old woman in the big, empty house." A decision, one that had been hovering at the edge of my consciousness for months, now solidified. I'm going to sell this place. I'm going to find a smaller apartment in the city. Something bright and modern, with a view. Something that is just for me. Arthur smiled, a genuine, approving smile. A new beginning, he said. I think that's a wonderful idea. After he left, I stood in a quiet house for a long time. The silence was different again. It was no longer mocking or oppressive. It was peaceful. It was a blank page. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Arthur helped me navigate everything. We found a real estate agent, not Sarah's firm, and put the house on the market. It sold almost immediately to a young family with children who fell in love with its good bones and big garden. They talked excitedly about filling the rooms with noise and laughter, and I was happy for them. I found a beautiful apartment on the 12th floor of a new building downtown. It had huge windows that looked out over the city skyline, a sleek, modern kitchen, and a small balcony where I could put pots of herbs. It was half the size of my old house and twice as bright. Sarah did try to call, a few days after the incident. I saw her name on the caller ID and I let it ring. I wasn't ready. A week later, a letter arrived, handwritten. It was a long, rambling apology, full of self-pity and excuses. It spoke of the pressure Mark was under, of their financial struggles, of the world they were trying to keep up with. It was all about them. There was no real acknowledgement of the pain she had caused me, no true ownership of the betrayal. It was the letter of a stranger. I read it once, then put it away. Forgiveness might come one day, but trust was a structure that had been demolished, and I was not inclined to rebuild it. My relationship with Leo, however, flourished. Sarah, perhaps in a rare moment of clarity or shame, did not stand in our way. I saw him every weekend. We went to museums, to the park, to the movies. We baked cookies in my new, shiny kitchen, and he told me about school and his friends. With him, I was just grandma. His love was pure and unconditional, a healing balm on the still tender wounds. One sunny afternoon, about 2 months after that fateful night, a large envelope arrived from the Richard Vance Architectural Foundation. Inside was a glossy brochure. On the cover was a photograph of a smiling, bright-eyed young woman. The headline read, "Introducing Maria Flores, the first recipient of the Richard and Eleanor Vance Scholarship." I sat in my new, comfortable armchair, the city sprawling out beneath my window, and I read her story. She was the daughter of immigrants, the first in her family to go to college, a brilliant student with a passion for sustainable design. Her letter of gratitude, printed in the brochure, was eloquent and heartfelt. She wrote of how the scholarship had not just changed her life, but the future of her entire family. Tears welled in my eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or anger. They were tears of profound, quiet joy. I had lost a daughter, but I had gained a new purpose. The money that was meant to be squandered on vanity and pretense was now building a future, creating a legacy of hope and opportunity. I had turned their ugly secret into something beautiful. They had stopped talking the second I walked into that room because I was their past, catching up with them. But I had walked out as my own future, a future I was now building for myself, one bright, hopeful day at a time. The silence in my new apartment was not an absence of sound. It was the sound of peace.